one rein to each horse, and it goes straight through from here to the outside of each horse.
When we would go carriage driving, well, first of all, he'd take me on a different route every day, and I do not know how he managed to do that.
What if the royal grandchild almost nobody talks about ends up being one of the biggest winners of Queen Elizabeth's private legacy? While the world was busy watching Prince Harry's fallout, Prince William's future, and the endless headlines surrounding the senior royals, something far quieter may have been unfolding behind palace walls. In the Queen's final years, private decisions were being made about treasured possessions, family loyalties, and who she truly wanted to remember in a meaningful way. And at the center of that story was not one of the usual names. It was Lady Louise Windsor. She is young, reserved, and rarely at the center of royal drama. To many people, she is barely known at all. But that may be exactly what makes this story so surprising. Because what Lady Louise appears to have quietly received, and what that may reveal about Queen Elizabeth's deepest affections, tells us far more about the royal family than most people realize. And if the reports and royal whispers are even partly true, then this was never just about money. It was about trust, closeness, and the people the Queen felt most at peace with in the final chapter of her life. To understand why Lady Louise matters so much in this story, you first have to understand the bond she shared with her grandmother. That bond was never loud. It was never turned into spectacle. It did not generate the kind of headlines that followed William and Harry for most of their lives. But inside royal circles, it was understood that Queen Elizabeth had a particular tenderness for Louise. And once you look at how Louise entered the world, that begins to make sense. Lady Louise Windsor was born on November 8, 2003, under deeply difficult circumstances. Her mother, Sophie, the Countess of Wessex, suffered a sudden placental abruption and had to be rushed to hospital. Prince Edward was away at the time and missed the birth entirely. Louise was delivered by emergency cesarean section, and both mother and baby faced serious complications. The situation was frightening, and for a family so used to public duty and composure, this was one of those rare moments where everything must have felt painfully personal. Louise was premature, fragile, and vulnerable from the start. She was taken to the neonatal unit, and concern for her was intense. For the Queen, that difficult beginning seems to have created something more than ordinary grandmotherly affection. It stirred a protective instinct. Louise was not simply another grandchild in the long royal line. She was a child whose earliest days had been marked by danger, and that appears to have left a deep impression. Her challenges did not end there. Louise was born with esotropia, a condition affecting eye alignment, and she underwent multiple procedures during childhood. She grew up more sheltered than many of her older cousins, and the age gap between her and much of the rest of the younger royals only added to her unique position within the family. She was younger, quieter, less exposed, and perhaps easier for the Queen to see simply as a child rather than as a future public figure being chased by the media. That seems to have shaped their relationship in a meaningful way. According to palace insiders over the years, the Queen genuinely enjoyed time with Louise, especially at Balmoral. There were claims that she had a soft spot for Louise and for her brother James, and that among the grandchildren, Louise held a particularly special place in her heart. That alone is striking in a family that includes heirs, spares, and personalities who dominate global attention. But Louise's appeal was not built on royal status. It was built on temperament. She came across as gentle, artistic, and thoughtful. Reports suggested that she won people over not by making demands, but by quietly fitting in. During family holidays, she was said to have helped William and Catherine with their children, even teaching Princess Charlotte to draw rabbits and deer. The Queen, who deeply valued small signs of character, seems to have noticed all of that. Louise's artistic side also mattered. One story claims the Queen allowed her to view Queen Victoria's private Highland sketches, items rarely shown to others. Whether you view that as a symbolic gesture or a simple act of grandmotherly affection, it points to trust. These were not just shared objects, they were shared pieces of private history. Royal commentators also described Louise as a child who brought out a softer side of the Queen, a side that the public rarely saw. There are recollections of quiet moments at home, even simple ones, like watching children's television together with Louise and her brother James. Those kinds of scenes matter because they reveal the true heart of royal relationships. Away from state duties, ceremonies, and cameras, the Queen was forming emotional attachments based not on rank, but on comfort. And in royal families, the comfort can become incredibly important. That helps explain why Prince Philip II left Lady Louise something deeply personal. When Prince Philip died in April 2021, much of the public focus was on the symbolism of his funeral. But for those who paid close attention, there were quieter details that carried enormous meaning. Among the most touching was the presence of his beloved ponies and carriage, reminders of the sport that had become one of the great passions of his later life. After arthritis ended his polo career, Philip turned to carriage driving with extraordinary seriousness. He competed internationally, represented Britain, and remained active in the sport well into his later years. This was not a passing hobby. It was one of the defining passions of his life, and in time, it became something he shared closely with Lady Louise. Philip personally taught Louise carriage driving when she was a teenager. They spent time together training in Windsor Great Park, and Sophie later said that Louise had a natural gift for the sport. That mattered enormously because Philip respected discipline, focus, and skill. He was not the type to hand down a cherished passion lightly. So when it emerged that he had left Louise his carriage, ponies, and related equipment, it felt like much more than an inheritance. But it felt like recognition. It was his way of passing on not just possessions, but identity, tradition, and the part of himself he most wanted preserved. Louise did not treat that legacy as symbolic decoration. She carried it forward. She competed. She drove one of Philip's carriages at the Royal Windsor Horse Show. She continued in the discipline he loved, and when she did, it looked less like a young royal playing with inherited privilege and more like someone honoring a bond that had been built over years of genuine closeness. That is what makes her inheritance story so powerful. These were not random gifts. They were personal gifts given to someone who clearly meant a great deal to both grandparents. And that brings us to the bigger question. What exactly could Queen Elizabeth herself have chosen to leave behind, and to whom? This is where the public often gets confused. People hear about the immense wealth associated with the monarchy and assume all of it belongs personally to the reigning monarch. It does not. The Crown Estate, including major properties such as Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, belongs to the institution, not the individual. Those assets pass automatically and are not freely distributed like private family heirlooms. But Queen Elizabeth also had substantial personal wealth of her own. That included privately owned estates like Balmoral and Sandringham, personal jewelry, horses, vehicles, artworks, and financial investments. Those belonged to her. And while much of that would naturally flow to King Charles, media reports have long suggested that the Queen had the ability to make personal choices about cherished items and specific gifts before her death. That is where the intrigue begins. Because according to various reports, Queen Elizabeth spent time in her final years considering who should receive her favorite personal belongings, essays. And if those reports are accurate, the decisions were not merely administrative, they were emotional. They reflected affection, trust, and perhaps even judgment. One of the most widely discussed areas was jewelry. There were claims that Catherine, Princess of Wales, was favored when it came to significant pieces from the Queen's personal jewelry collection. If true, that would have been a powerful signal. Jewelry in royal life is never just jewelry. It is symbolism, continuity, and approval made visible. So, to leave important pieces to Catherine would be to affirm her place not only in the future of the monarchy, but in the Queen's private world as well. And according to sensational reports, that may not have sat well with Camilla's side of the family. That is where the emotional tension in this story sharpens. Because once the Queen's private preferences are seen through the lens of inheritance, every gift begins to look like a message. Every omission begins to feel like a statement. If Catherine was favored in jewelry and Lady Louise was favored through emotional legacy and personal trust, what did that say about where others stood? Some reports suggested that Camilla resented the closeness between the Queen and Catherine, and others implied that the distribution of personal gifts reflected loyalties that did not fully extend to Camilla's family. Whether every detail is true or not, the narrative gained traction because it fit a larger perception that Queen Elizabeth valued bloodline, steadiness, and quiet duty above ambition, noise, or social maneuvering. Camilla's children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, have long occupied an unusual position around the royal family. They are close enough to the monarchy to be seen, but not fully woven into its deepest traditions in the way the Queen's direct descendants are. That distinction matters. In royal families, belonging is not just about proximity. It is about lineage, service, and long-tested trust. And if the Queen made her personal decisions along those lines, then Lady Louise's position becomes much easier to understand. She was the daughter of Prince Edward and Sophie, two figures often viewed as among the most loyal and least troublesome members of the royal household. Edward, the Queen's youngest son, built a far quieter life than his siblings. He largely avoided the scandals, rivalries, and public emotional upheavals that defined other branches of the family. Sophie, meanwhile, came to be seen as one of the Queen's most dependable daughters-in-law. That reputation was earned over time. Sophie stepped away from her own professional career and committed herself to royal work with consistency and discretion. She supported charities, stayed out of unnecessary controversy, and raised her children in a way that seemed intentionally grounded. That mattered deeply to the Queen. There is a revealing story Sophie once shared about Louise as a child. Louise came home puzzled because people had told her that her grandmother was the Queen. She reportedly said she did not understand. To her, Elizabeth was simply grandma. That kind of innocence is rare in royal life. And for Queen Elizabeth, who lived under the crushing weight of history, duty, and expectation, that may have been priceless. Around Edward and Sophie's family, she could experience a more natural, less performative kind of affection. Their home life was said to feel warm, stable, and refreshingly normal by royal standards. Louise herself seemed to reflect those values. Rather than behaving like someone entitled by rank, she reportedly took a summer job at a garden center before university. That detail became one of the defining images of her public persona. Here was a royal granddaughter who was not trying to dominate the spotlight, not chasing celebrity, and not leaning entirely on privilege. She appeared modest, disciplined, and self-contained. In a family where attention often goes to the loudest figure in the room, that kind of restraint can become a source of strength. By the time Edward was granted the Duke of Edinburgh title, it was seen by many as confirmation that his branch of the family had earned deep trust, and with trust comes access. With access comes affection. And with affection in families like this comes inheritance. That leads to another reason Lady Louise has quietly become such an intriguing royal figure. Her rise has happened almost entirely out of the public eye. While William and Harry became global subjects of fascination, Louise focused on school, university, and building a life with relative privacy. She studied English, history, politics, and drama, subjects that suggest seriousness, curiosity, and awareness of public life. Soon after the Queen's death, she began her studies at St. Andrews, a university already rich with royal associations. Then came another development that caught attention: her involvement in military training. That, too, felt symbolic. Queen Elizabeth's own young adulthood was shaped by wartime duty. She joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service and became the first female royal to serve actively in the armed forces. So when Louise appeared to take steps toward reserve military involvement, royal watchers naturally drew comparisons. It added another layer to her image. Not just quiet and dutiful, but potentially serious-minded in a way that echoed the Queen herself. Commentators also noted that Louise seems to reflect qualities from both grandparents. She has the reserve and understated manner often associated with Elizabeth, alongside the carriage-driving passion she inherited from Philip. Even speculation about future careers in law, diplomacy, or military service only strengthened the impression that she may be well-suited to a more substantial role one day, should she choose it. And that possibility matters because the monarchy is changing. The number of younger working royals remains limited. Reliable, scandal-free, duty-oriented figures are increasingly valuable. In that kind of environment, Lady Louise stands out not because she demands attention, but because she does not, which brings us back to the tension surrounding Camilla's family. If Queen Elizabeth's personal gifts and emotional loyalties really did favor Catherine, Lady Louise, and the branch of the family built around Edward and Sophie, then the message becomes uncomfortable for others. And it suggests that despite Camilla's eventual position beside King Charles, there were limits to how fully her side of the family was embraced within the Queen's private emotional circle. That would explain why this story is not simply about money or jewelry. It is about hierarchy, legacy, and belonging. Lady Louise is a direct descendant of both Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. She carries their bloodline, their affection, and in many ways, their quieter values. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes may be close to royal life, but they do not occupy that same place in the family story. So if frustration existed, it likely came from something deeper than the value of material gifts. It came from what those gifts represented. Lady Louise, without demanding status, and may have received something even more important than public prominence, private approval. She seems to have been trusted, cherished, and remembered in a way that cannot be manufactured. And in royal history, that kind of silent favor often proves more powerful than the titles people chase most loudly. Perhaps that is the real twist in this story. The royal few paid the least attention to may turn out to be the one who inherited the most meaningful legacy of all. Not because she fought for it, not because she expected it, but because in a family shaped by duty, memory, and careful judgment, she quietly became the person her grandparents felt safest passing it on to. And in the House of Windsor, those who do not reach for power are sometimes the ones who end up with the greatest share of trust, affection, and lasting significance.